Chapter 3. Here, Twilight, I found some tea bags in the kitchen, Spike said, holding up the warm cup of tea for the lavender unicorn. Thanks, Spike, Twilight mumbled quietly. She levitated the cup up to her mouth and slowly sipped on the tea. It had taken a while to get the strength back in her legs, but once they had recovered, Spike led her down to the living room. Somehow, he managed to find a blanket and wrapped it around her. In this moment of need, he was proving to her that he really was her number one assistant. I'm sorry, Spike, Twilight sighed softly, looking into the murky waters of her tea. I should be the strong one right now, not you. Twilight, how are your wounds? Spike interrupted her, looking at her seriously. Twilight blinked a little confused before looking down at her body. She shifted the blanket a little to get a better look at the damage that had been done. Her chest was swelling, though she was actually surprised at how much smaller it was. She expected bigger bruises from the way it had felt, but she seemed surprisingly well off there. There were also the worst of her injuries. The cuts she'd received from the creature's mouth had already stopped bleeding. My wounds are fine, Spike, but why is that? You just got hurt, Twilight. I'm fine. You rest for the moment, and I'll continue when you're ready. Spike interrupted her again with a soft smile. Twilight blinked in confusion at him before returning the smile. Sometimes I wonder if you're really a baby dragon anymore, Twilight chuckled softly, closing her eyes to sip at her tea. Yeah, I'm growing up pretty fast, Spike nodded happily. There was a comfortable silence sharing between the two of them, leaving Twilight to her thoughts as she drank the warm liquid. Spike smiled as he watched Twilight relax before softly scratching the back of his head. Hey, Twilight! I know it's a little bit soon, but... Twilight looked up at her dragon's assistant from the rim of her cup. When we were in the room, I saw a key on the floor next to that thing. I think that might be the key for the door. I didn't grab it because I was helping you out, but... Say no more, Spike. Twilight softly nodded her head, putting the cup of tea down and standing up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. I'll go grab that key. Wait, are you sure? Maybe you should just... Spike tried to stop her from acting hastily, but Twilight just held out her hoof to silence him. Thanks for your concern, Spike, but I'm okay now. Besides, I can handle retrieving a key from a room. I can't let you do everything. She took a deep breath. I'm supposed to be taking care of you, not the other way around. She smiled softly at him. It's okay to need help, Twilight. Spike narrowed his eyebrow, looking worried for her. I know, and if I need it, I'll ask. Twilight rubbed her head gently. I'll be okay. Just wait for me, and I'll be right back. All right, Twilight. I trust you. Spike still looked at the lavender unicorn with worry, but did as he had asked. Thank you, Spike. She nodded before turning to the stairs. She looked up the flight towards the walkway and led to the room they had escaped from, swallowing a lump that had formed in her throat, and then slowly began to ascend back up. Come on, Twilight. If Spike can handle this, you can too. He's just a baby dragon. You're an adult unicorn and Celestia's personal assistant or student. You can face what you did. She mentally reassured herself several times. She could feel her face flushing with anxiety, her heart beating more heavily with each hoof step. She was trying to force herself to stay calm, taking deep breaths while repeating to herself that everything would be okay. At the top of the steps, she hesitantly looked into the half-open doorway leading to the destroyed room. Even as she approached, she could glimpse some of the rubble and destruction within. Most prominently, the spatters of blood that had come from the thrashing. You okay, Twilight? Spike's voice carried from the first door. Yeah, I'm fine, Spike. She quickly flashed him an assuring smile before walking to the door and stepping inside. A hoof went straight to her mouth as she observed the remains of the room. The creature's corpse was still there in the center, lying limp in the pool of its own blood. She couldn't look away, only barely able to discern the destroyed decorations everywhere. The wrecked walls and ceilings, the room utter chaos laid out around her, but something was also amiss. Something about the room didn't seem right, as if some important detail that had left there was no longer where it should be. The sword! Why isn't it still... Twilight stared in the shock in the head of the creature. The sword that should have been impaled through its skull wasn't there. Instead, looking just in front of the creature, she saw it laying on the ground. Not a speck of blood on it. Right next to it on the floor, she saw a small glint of light reflecting off of a small key. Had the sword fallen out of its head? Had it not actually been dead and managed to pull the sword out before it died? Had something else come along and pulled it out? Had she or Spike pulled it out without either of them realizing? Were they still not alone? Twilight gulped down another lump of nervousness that had formed in her throat. Not daring to take another step into the room, she felt fortunate that her desired items were already within her line of sight. She quickly lit up her horn and wrapped the sword and the key with a magical aura. The two items quickly disappeared into their waiting storage inside her pool of magic, and the room grew dim once more. She hadn't planned on bringing the sword with her, but if more things were going to go wrong, then she might need it to defend herself again. Not waiting to see what surprises might pop out at her, Twilight quickly turned around and headed back down the stairs. "Okay, Spike, I grabbed the key. Let's go ahead and get out of this place," Twilight said, trying to hide her desire to leave from Spike as she hurriedly walked past him. "Oh, sure, Twilight. Once we head out, we should continue looking for our friends or the princess," Spike suggested, making a mental note of the task at hand, while following after the lavender unicorn. Twilight wasted no time turning her pendant on and illuminating the kitchen. She summoned the key once more and approached the locked door. Fitting the key into the lock, with a turn of the key opened the lock. With a push of the hoof, the door opened, revealing the fog-laden world just beyond it. It led to the backyard of the house that was surrounded by a small fence cornering it off from the streets of Ponyville. It seemed a small garden used to be raised there, but the small patch of vegetables had fallen to a state of rotten disuse. The grass was dying, and the air suddenly felt thick. "Whoa, look, Twilight, it's snowing again," Spike said, eagerly running into the backyard without a care. "Spike, wait! We don't know if it's safe yet!" Twilight cried out, chasing after the baby dragon. Spike didn't seem to care, though, just looking up into the fog-filled sky as specks of white floated down around him. He briefly spun in place before opening his mouth and sticking his tongue out, letting out one of the flakes of snow on his tongue. Instantly, he retched and started spitting, wiping his mouth of the vile snowflake. "Oh, that wasn't snow at all!" Spike groaned as Twilight walked up next to him. "Not snow? What do you mean it's not snow?" Twilight wondered, looking up at the flakes. She held out a hoof as a speck landed on it. She expected it to be cold and to melt. Instead, it seemed to smear on her coat. Perplexed, she drew her nose closer to it, but it didn't notice any smell aside from the thick smell that seemed to hang in the air. Curious about what Spike had tasted, she licked the speck that had landed on her hoof. "This isn't snow," Twilight whispered to herself, suddenly realizing what was falling from the sky. "It's ash!" Suddenly, the thick smell of air in the air made sense and brought a horrible realization to her mind. Either something in Ponyville was burning, or these were the remains of something having been burnt and scattered throughout the city or the sky. Twilight?" Spike said, suddenly scared of something. Twilight looked down at the baby dragon before looking to where his eyes had followed. She regretted what she saw. It must have been the owner of the house, or at least what she was left of her. It was a mare she vaguely memorized, one of the newest ponies to move to Ponyville. She had a strikingly white coat and silver mane. Her body was covered with lacerations, as if she had been severely whipped all over, staining her white coat with blood. But worst of all was that she was been mounted to a large wooden cross with giant nails piercing each of her hooves and holding her in place. The mare to which this had happened was named Winter Withers. Winter had been crucified. Oh, Celestia, we have to get her down, Twilight said, racing over to the crucified pony. She wrapped the mare in her magic, gripping hard against the nails before pulling them out carefully. The body went limp in Twilight's magical embrace as she carefully lowered the pony to the ground. As the white mare lay there, Twilight put a hoof to her neck, desperate for any sign of life. Is she? Spike muttered, walking up slowly. Twilight was quiet for a few minutes, hoping for a conclusion that wasn't Spike was thinking. She checked several spots where she knew she was able to feel a heartbeat. She put her ear next to her mouth to try and hear breathing. Finally, her horn lit up and she placed a small blanket of magic on her chest to try and detect a heartbeat. Twilight's face grew dim as the magic of her horn faded, closing her eyes and softly shaking her head. Oh no, why is this happening, Twilight? Spike asked, now truly scared. It had been one thing for Spike when he had seen a monster dead. It was another thing to see a pony mutilated and hung up for display. I don't know, Spike, Twilight spoke softly, looking down at the mare's face. Winter was a face she rarely saw on the streets of Ponyville. Someone who had recently moved there to get away from her city life and enjoy a peaceful one there. They only talked on 2 occasions, and with it being a small town, she was having a hard time adjusting to every pony knowing every pony else. Twilight stood up, her horn lighting up once more. With her magic, she quickly formed a shovel and began to dig up the dirt of the backyard. Spike watched silently as Twilight dug the hole. The 2 of them could hear only the stifled sound of the shovel digging in the dirt as she dug deeper. It took a long time for the hole to be deep enough to satisfy Twilight, yet not a word was shared between the 2 of them. Twilight carefully wrapped the white mare's body with her magic and placed it down at the bottom of the hole. Picking up the excavated dirt with her magic, she gingerly placed it back in, covering the mare and filling the hole. She made sure the dirt was meticulously flat before forming a block of wood into the shape of a headstone and placing it at the front of the grave. She carefully etched into it, "Here lays Winter Withers. May she find a peaceful rest." Twilight sat at the foot of the freshly dug grave, looking solemnly at the ground. Spike walked up and sat next to her, putting a claw against her back. "Maybe we should say a few words," Spike mentioned solemnly. "You're right, but I barely knew anything about her. I met her briefly, Spike, even enough to know her name and why she moved, but she was just a passing friend." Twilight sighed softly, not sure what to make of this. Just knowing every pony in Ponyville wasn't enough to call them true friends. If she only had one conversation, she could maybe call them a friend, but she didn't truly know a pony in that case. It took a while to truly earn great friends like the ones she'd had. "Winter," Twilight spoke up softly, "I'm sorry, I never got to know you that well. You seem like an interesting pony, and I know you were starting to enjoy life here in Ponyville. You were starting to make friends, and who knows, maybe you could have became a great member of the community." Twilight paused for a moment, turning her head away from the grave, feeling guilt hit her stomach. "And I'm sorry you had to die this way. You didn't deserve this. No pony deserves this." She took a deep breath and looked back at the grave. "And I promise, your death won't have been in vain. You may not have been the closest of friends, but you were still one of mine. I'll put a stop to whatever's going on here, Winter. You will have my word." Twilight stood, feeling the weight of her words in her heart. Spike looked up at the unicorn, not sure how to feel anymore. In the span of a few minutes, the two of them had been through more emotions than they had ever thought they'd go through in a lifetime. The young dragon's body was surrounded with magic as Twilight lifted him up onto her back. "Alright, Spike, we have to find the others now. We can't leave things like this. Not if innocent ponies are going to get hurt." Twilight spoke with near vengeance in her voice. But Twilight, what if they... Spike hesitated, looking back at the bloody crucifix that stood impaled in the ground before them. Twilight looked at the device, glaring at it. Twilight was reminded of when she had read about the horrible devices, where she had learned what being killed this way was called, in the biography of Merlin the Great. "Upon hilltops of St. Clyde's Row was where I saw the ghastly sights of our fellow blood nailed to wood in the shape of a cross to serve two purposes, one of execution, the other of warning. Their bodies spoke of the atrocities the nation would commit. If you broke their laws, invaded their land, or offended their nobles, the fate of death was brought to you. You would be seen by those you knew and loved, by your enemies, and by your goddess. That you were an example of their power. They called this execution the crucifixion." Twilight grit her teeth as her horn flared up once more. The bloody cross was gripped in her magic and let out a loud groan as the wood began to bend. With a loud and powerful snap, the cross fell over, slamming into the ground in two pieces. Twilight stared with satisfaction at her work and walked towards the edge of the small picket fence that surrounded Winter's yard. "Our friends are going to be okay, Spike. They wouldn't let this town get to them so easily. Now hold on," Twilight told the baby dragon. Taking her advice, he gripped tightly to her neck as she took a few steps back and galloped at full speed. She cleared the fence in a single jump, landing once more into the cobblestone streets of Ponyville. "Spike, do you know where we are in the town at the moment?" Twilight asked, pulling the map out of her pool of magic and handing it to Spike. Spike fumbled with it for a moment before opening it properly. He swallowed down nervousness that had been building up and cleared his throat, examining the map. "I guess we're on Penn Street." Spike followed the roads, noting the buildings that had been around before being chased into the mansion. Then the location of the mansion itself. "So Sugarcube Corner should be in the nearest place. We just have to head to the right and down the road," Spike explained. Just as he finished, though, the medallion on Twilight's neck began to let out a buzz. "What's that?" Spike said, jumping into the air and landing on Twilight's back. Twilight grunted at the sign and sighed softly. "It's something I found in the house that seemed important." Twilight lifted the necklace of her pendant up to show Spike the medallion that was attached to it. It was doing this back at the house too. It was acting right before... Twilight was interrupted by the sound of metal scraping against the cobblestone. Spike and Twilight instantly turned their attention to the direction of the fog, seeing a silhouette of a pony once more. "Oh no, not more of them!" Twilight growled, reaching into her magic and swiftly pulling out the ancient rusted sword. She inspected the condition of it, noting that it was still holding together well despite her recent encounter. She feared that it was on the verge of breaking, many of the chips digging into the blade. However, it was something to defend her and the young one she had to protect. So help Celestia if anything had to come harm to Spike. "Twilight, come on, let's get out of here!" Spike said, tugging on her mane. "We shouldn't fight it. It might draw more. We're not surrounded already." Twilight quickly glanced around, seeing that the only silhouette around them was in fact the one slowly approaching them. Looking back at the figure in the fog, she began to slowly walk backwards away from it. The figure didn't pick up any speed, just continued to saunter slowly toward them, dragging whatever weapon it carried along the ground. "We're not getting any closer to our friends if we keep running away, but I understand we shouldn't fight it. We don't have to." Twilight returned the sword to her magic, then quickly turned and ran from the creature. It didn't chase after them, and the silhouette fell out of view. As it did, the buzzing of the medallion grew silent. "Hey, that sound went away," Spike said, taking note of the silence returning as Twilight moved into a quick jog over a full sprint. "Hey, you're right, Spike," she said, glowing slowly to a walk as she examined the runic symbols of the metal. "It seems to make noise whenever a creature draws close. I think it's warning us of danger when it draws near." Twilight was amazed at this deduction, that something she'd found was so useful. "Well, that's convenient," Spike said, reaching around and poking the medallion softly. "If it makes a noise whenever danger is near, all we have to do is avoid dangerous areas." "I don't know if that'll be as easy as it sounds, Spike," Twilight said, thinking back to the mansion. "We only got the key to leave because I killed that thing. It dropped the key when it died, and the medallion was buzzing before I encountered it." Twilight sighed as she thought about it, putting the pieces together in her head. "Whatever is going on in this town, it seems to be following some strange rule set. You have to follow the rules or else you won't get out." "Are you sure, Twilight? That makes it seem like something is trying to play a game with us." Spike scratched his head at the words. "Maybe, Spike, but think about it. When we were locked inside the library, we couldn't escape until we solved the puzzles on those boxes. Then, when we finally got outside, we were rounded up into that mansion. Then the only way out of the mansion safely was through that creature." Twilight listed the events for them to analyze logically. "So you're saying that the only way out of this mess is to obey whatever rules are presented to us?" Spike felt a chill run down his back as he spoke. "I'm afraid so, Spike. And it seems the consequences of disobeying are dire." Twilight spoke gravely. "Do you think that's what happened in the winter?" Twilight stopped walking, head instantly lowering to stare at the ground. "I'm sorry, I just..." Spike began to mumble. "I don't know, Spike," Twilight sighed, lifting her head up. "But Winter, she was crucified, and when you crucify a pony, it isn't just to kill them, it's to send a message." Twilight narrowed her eyes again. "And I think the message was intended for us. I don't know what it meant, but I plan on finding out." Spike didn't say anything after that. He just sat on Twilight's back as she began to walk once more. The only sound the two of them heard was the loud click of her hooves hitting the cobblestone road. The road she was heading down would eventually lead to a fork, where she could either turn to head for the schoolhouse or down further into Ponyville. Twilight came to a dead stop at the end of the road, her mouth slowly falling open as she stared at the building that appeared before them in the fog. "Whoa, I don't remember that building being Ponyville," Spike said, looking at it in confusion. "That's because it doesn't belong in Ponyville," Twilight explained, looking at the building once more. Where more houses should have been instead of a large brick building. A small flight of stairs stood before double doors that led into the building. Above them was a weathered sign seemingly battered by the elements that read Stalingrad Library. "Well, if it doesn't belong in Ponyville, what's it doing here?" Spike asked, perplexed, not accustomed to buildings suddenly shifting entire locations like this. "I'm not sure, Spike, but I'm certain we're supposed to find out," Twilight said, stepping closer to the building. "Are you sure this is a good idea, Twilight?" Spike asked hesitantly as she began to climb the stairs. "Good idea? Probably not, but if this really is Stalingrad Library, there might still be other ponies inside. One of our friends might have taken refuge in here." Twilight slowly pushed open the front door, finding a dark abyss inside waiting for her. "Or we might find out more clues as to what happened here." Her horn lit up, and magic surrounded the pendant around her neck, causing the crystal to light up the area before her. The door opened up to a hallway. The red carpet floor looked like it had seen better days. The color was worn with age, and a layer of dark dust seemed to cover it. The cream-colored wallpaper was peeling and seemed to be covered in scratches. She could see the reception desk from the entrance. "Whoa! What happened to this place?" Spike wondered aloud as Twilight walked over to the desk. "I'm not sure, Spike, but we should probably keep our voices to a whisper." Twilight whispered back to the dragon on her back as she approached the rotting wooden front desk. Her eyes began to scan what lay on top of it. "Why to a whisper?" Spike asked quietly. "If there are other ponies, wouldn't we want them to know we're here? We could also attract more of those zombie things from outside if they're in here," Twilight replied. "Medallion is quiet so far, but I don't want a chance to have having to fight something. At least not with you in harm's way." Twilight spoke. Spike spoke softly, but was interrupted as Twilight's horn lit up once more. She picked up a map from off the reception desk and quickly examined it. Alright, the layout of the library is pretty simple. We should be able to find any pony who is here quickly. She rolled the map up and let it vanish into her pool of magic. And with any luck, we might find some information too. Twilight then levitated the note that had been lying next to the map. It was a sloppily written note, as if whoever had written it was in a hurry, but it was just clear enough for her to be able to read what was on there. Oh no, I lost them. I can't believe I lost them. Those things are going to guard them now, I know it. I can't hide in the back room without them. I'm done for. I won't survive. Oh Celestia, why did it have to be a puzzle? What's it say, Twilight? Spike looked at the note curiously, not able to get a good look of it past Twilight's head. I think it's saying that in order to get into the back room of the library, we need to find items that are being guarded around the library. Twilight gulped softly, vanishing the note into her magic. So, you're going to have to fight again? Spike wrapped his arms around Twilight's neck a little tighter, as if hugging her. Most likely, Spike, if we want to find out what's back there. It wasn't a conclusion Twilight was happy to make, nor was it one she wanted to face. But she'd already killed one creature that had been out to kill her. If she kept it to a self-defense, she might be able to stay sane. Her eyes wandered to the small dragon on her back, who looked back at her with a hint of fear in his eyes. Besides, she had to protect Spike no matter the cost. She wasn't about to let anything happen to her young assistant. Twilight turned from the reception desk and walked a few paces down the hallway when she saw the first door to her right. A sign next to the door labeled it as the reference section. Well, I guess this is a good place as any to start searching, Twilight said, with a bit of hesitation in her voice. Spike gripped her neck softly as Twilight carefully opened the door. Her light going into the room was able to pick out several bookshelves, all containing several different books lined up on them. Most of the books appeared to be worn with age, dust collecting on the shelves and bindings. She stepped quietly into the room, looking back and forth with her light. At the entranceway, she could see large piles of books had been dropped at the end of the bookshelves, blocking a pony's path from going around. The only path they could take was to go forward between the openings of the shelves. Twilight took a few steps further into the reference section, slowly closing the door behind her. When her ears perked up, her medallion began to softly hiss. Spike gripped Twilight's neck a little harder, and she instinctively pulled the sword out from her magic, gripping it tight with her magic. She stood in place, waiting for whatever creature was causing the hissing to step forth. However, despite standing in place for what felt like an eternity, no creature walked out in front of them. They could only hear the soft hissing of the medallion. Softly swallowing her anxiety, Twilight began to take slow, careful steps forward. The hissing remained quiet for her first few steps until she was standing at the opening between the next two shelves of books. The medallion slowly began to buzz louder, but now it was accompanied by the sound of something chewing. She looked to her left, seeing another pile of books blocking the end of the path. She then slowly turned to look at her right. At first, she thought she was seeing a pony hunched before a small pile of books, but something was clearly wrong with that. She focused more and details began to fit into her vision. What she thought was a pony's back seemed to be made of rotting brown leather that was moving and bulging, as if giant worms lived under the skin. Several areas looked as if they'd swung together, like the skin was a suit made out of rotten pony hide. Extending out of an opening in the skin on its back were two purple and red muscle-like tentacles that sharped to a point at the end. Its head lifted up, revealing two flaps of what looked like a pony's head falling to the side, revealing a skin-stripped and eyeless head that was chewing hungrily on a book. Twilight almost gagged. She could hardly describe the horror of the creature before her. Its head shredded the book in the mouth easily, swallowing whole the cover and the pages. The tentacles on its back suddenly reached out to the bookshelf next to it and stabbed the book straight through its bindings. It picked the book up and lay down next to a small pile the monster had gathered, its head digging back down to grab a hold of another book. Twilight slowly moved, continuing across the gap in the bookshelves away from the monster. It didn't seem to notice her as the monster disappeared from sight past the bookshelf once more. The medallion's loud buzzing dulled to a soft buzz as she let out a soft sigh. Twilight, is that thing?" Spike hissed into her ear, gripping hard against her neck, though being careful not to choke her. "I don't know, Spike," Twilight hissed back, lowering her sword as she continued to slowly back away. "But I'd rather avoid it if possible." Twilight felt her back bump into a large pile of discarded books. She turned around and turned her head to see that the path ended because of the obstruction. She glared at it softly and lit her horn to a little brighter, trying to grab hold of the books and move them out of the way. However, the books refused to budge, as if weighed tight down into place. She glared softly and tried teleporting the obstruction out of her way. However, despite the spellcasting, the books didn't move. It's as if they were just like the locked doors, immune to magic. "What is this place and its magic immunity?" Twilight growled softly, checking her location in the short maze of bookshelves. She could see the end of the room, counting off 6 bookshelves within the room in total. The large piles of books seemed to position in such a perfect way as to direct her straight towards that creature. She quickly pulled the map of the library back out and checked its contents. It seemed that there were 3 rooms just as the other end that were used for studying. However, with her path blocked by a large pile of books, the only route that seemed like it would reach them would be able to go through that creature that was devouring the books. "Spike!" Twilight spoke softly, yet seriously. "I need you to get off my back for a moment." "Twilight?" Spike asked hesitantly. "What are you going to do?" Twilight took a deep breath, closing her eyes and stilling her nerves. She pictured the scene back from the library of Spike torn to pieces. She pictured the creature from the mansion that tried to kill her. She pictured the zombie soldiers each carrying weapons and attempting to cut them down with their weapons. These creatures were cold and harsh. They didn't care for the sanctity of life. They blinded sought to kill and harm. And though she desired to leave them alone, she knew that she couldn't avoid this fate for long now. Though they were living creatures, she had to leave them as obstacles. No more than puzzles standing between her and getting out of this miserable situation. To save her friends, to find Celestia, to let no more harm to come to any pony. "Spike, I'm going to take care of that creature." She raised the chipped and damaged sword in front of her, looking over with her eyes. "And if you're on my back, you may get hurt. And no matter what, I can't let you get hurt, Spike." "Twilight, no! You shouldn't fight it unless there's no other choice." Spike tugged at her mane, trying to persuade her not to be foolish. "What if it hurts you, Twilight?" His voice began to rise, Twilight eyeing him carefully. "If something happens to you, what am I supposed to do? What do I tell the others if I find them and if you're... Spike shut his eyes and tears burned at him. A lump formed in his throat. Twilight eyed the hallway of the bookshelves carefully. She could still hear the creature devouring away at the books. Its distraction seemed deep. Spike felt himself being shrouded in magic and forcibly lift up off Twilight. "Twilight, no, Spike began to shout, but found himself muffled, when suddenly embraced deeply into Twilight's chest. His eyes widened as he tried to look up at the lavender unicorn that held him close to her with one hoof and a hug. "Spike, I know all that," Twilight spoke softly, trying to calm the young dragon. Spike wrapped his arms around her neck and hugged her tightly. "I can't promise I won't get hurt, but I'm not about to die and leave you behind, Spike. I'm also not about to let those things hurt you either. So if I can stop one before it has the chance to strike, I'm going to take that chance." Twilight's voice seemed different to the young dragon's ears. In a way, he very rarely heard Twilight speak. It was as the voice of a mother was coming from the lavender unicorn now. But Spike tried to interject, but Twilight just gently shushed him, rubbing his head softly. "Please, Spike, I promise, everything will be all right." She spoke calm to the young dragon, and down it and seemed to be working. "Just wait for me right here. This'll only take a moment." Spike was quiet for a moment, holding onto Twilight tightly. He didn't want her to have to fight, but the more Twilight's words sunk in, and the more he thought about the situation, he began to realize it was truly about his inevitable outcome. "Okay, just be careful," Spike spoke softly, shifting away from Twilight. Twilight nodded her head and took another deep breath. She could hear her footsteps echo loudly now as she rounded the corner, holding the sword out before her. The creature came into view once more under the shrine of her pendant. The creature tore out a large section of paper from its recent book, chewing up the leaflets of paper before swallowing them menacingly. Twilight stepped forward towards the creature. The creature stopped to turn its head. The buzzing of Twilight's medallion began to grow. It grew feverish with noise, crying out to her that danger was right in front of her. The tentacles on the creature's back flicked back and forth. The spiked ends seemed to cut the air they sailed through. The creature let out a snarl as its skin moved underneath the flesh it wore, as if more tentacles were waiting to burst out. Twilight narrowed her eyes, keeping her sword even before her, for the slight shift of movement from the monster. Though it had no eyes, she could feel it watching her, waiting for her to make her move. It seemed to want to ambush her, attacking her when she wasn't ready for it, but she wouldn't give it the chance. She could feel a small sweat forming on her brow. The creature wasn't going to budge, and if she showed her back, it was going to strike. She would have to make the first move. Her hoof took another step closer. The creature let out a large wail as the serpent-like tentacle struck out at her. They sailed through the air, intent on getting her blood. Without a moment of hesitation, her sword swung broadly, striking both of the offended appendages. They flew to the side as she drew closer once more. The creature turned now to face the unicorn, challenging it, letting out another screech at its foe. The foul odor of its breath hit Twilight's nose. She grit her teeth and raised the sword to swing down at its head. One of the tentacles came striking down towards her. Her sword quickly sailed through the air, striking the limb and stopped it just short of slashing her. She poured her magic into the sword and slashed it fiercely against the limb. The creature cried out as the spike end of the tentacle flew off, carrying a trail of blood with it. And blinded by the path of the creature charged, Twilight opened its mouth wide, intent on biting down on her. The sword moved swiftly down towards her, her magic holding it tightly. With a thrust, the sword struck the creature, burying itself deep between inside of its open mouth. Twilight dodged out of the way as the creature crashed onto the bookshelf, writhing in pain and smashing its head against the bookcase to remove the horrible item that had been lodged itself down its throat. Her horn lit up and engulfed the sword inside of the creature, swiftly pulling it out of the creature. The creature gagged and roared as blood spilled from its mouth, lifting what it would dare to call hooves to its throat. Grabbing for some relief, the single sharpened tentacle that remained slashed around haphazardly, striking books and shelves and attempted to fend its own. Twilight wasted no time and aimed the sword with a loud cry. She thrusted the sword forward, impaling the creature through the side of its head. The sword embedded itself into the bookshelf behind it, nailing the creature to the surface. The creature writhed a moment longer, trying desperately to cling on to what remained of its life, before finally falling limp. The creature crashed the hardest from its position into the air. Twilight breathed heavily, letting the shock of the moment sink in. She had been focused. She had been calculating. She had carefully seen through the creature's movements and had struck it down when it was the most vulnerable. "I don't get it, Princess," a young Twilight spoke as she walked through the training grounds with her teacher. "How come your soldiers train so hard to fight when no one fights in Equestria?" She admired the several stallions, each wielding swords in a different manner as they struck wooden mannequins. Some wielding weighted wooden practice swords as they sparred with each other, ensuring they're in top shape. "Well," Celestia thought her words carefully, "it's true that the peace has reigned during my rule for a very long time now. It wasn't always that way. There are times when ponies or other creatures would rather settle things with hooves than with words." She spoke solemnly. "But it's not just for those moments. We live in a world filled with creatures that wish to do us harm. There are many creatures who would enjoy feasting upon ponies as a snack." What really?" Filly Twilight looked at her teacher with a big sorrowful eyes, scarred at the idea of what scene in the world might come to eat her. Celestia looked down at the sight and softly chuckled. "Never fear, Twilight. I worked every day to ensure peace remains in Equestria." The princess smiled sincerely. "And if you're so worried about your safety, you can always partake in practicing your swordsmanship between downtime of your studies." "Really?" Twilight spoke curiously, looking back at the guards. One of the White Pegasus guards, having overheard the conversation, slowly walked over to the small filly, smiling as if he looked down at her. "Hello there. He spoke proudly, but sincerely. Twilight backed up a little, almost frightened. I heard you'd be interested in some sword training. How'd you like to try? He asked, holding out a wooden sword he'd been practicing with. Twilight looked at the sword hesitantly before moving a hoof over to touch it. The Pegasus guard moved it approachingly towards her. She grabbed the sword with both hooves as he let go of it, Twilight dropping to the ground with the weight of the equipment. She got on her hooves and lifted as if it was her legs could lift the sword, only managing to lift it a little ways off the ground. She panted heavily as she gave up trying to lift it. This elicited a chuckle from both the guard and the princess. Here, I'll go get you a lighter training sword. The ones we use when young fowls like yourself want to practice their swordsmanship. The guard smiled, picking up the wooden sword with his teeth and turning back to the training grounds, heading for the equipment shed. Why are those things so heavy? Twilight grumbled, folding her hooves as she sat on the ground defeated. It's because the material of a real sword to make them strong and reliable also makes them heavy, so the training swords are weighted, Celestia smiled, explaining. Have you taken an interest in training with a sword? A little, Twilight thought it over in her head before standing up on her hooves and smiling. I want to become a great unicorn magician, and if I practice sword fighting with magic, it'll keep my studies overall. She seemed eagerly excited. Besides, if I learn magic, how often will I need to fight with a sword? Twilight and Celestia shared a small laugh.